baby, listen to me speak it. No matter what, just say it hard.
Pop, persuadable. What's going on, boo-boos? Man, I love y'all. It may not mean nothing to y'all. Understand nothing was done for me. No, that's not true. I got a lot of stuff done for me. And what that means is that y'all been supporting me for so long. We hit 30,000 subscribers on YouTube and we applied for Twitch partnership. Thank you very much for that. Enough about me. Let's start talking about, is the game hunter or survivor based? This has been an ongoing debate. And so I was like, you know what is the most objective way to measure this, right? Beyond the banter and the anecdotal evidence, what is the most objective way to measure this? And what sort of data can we collect in order to see how this game is balanced? Is the game different for different servers? So I'm not sure if you all know this, but one of the things that the devs do is that they release data for at least the China server in that first week after a season reset. And they've done this for probably a while, but I have access to season 11's data as well as season 12 data. And within the first week after a new update, or rather a season reset, essentially hunters are not only winning more in every single tier, but they're also winning and drawing more in every single tier. All right. So a lot of people, including myself at various moments, depending on the season, etc., we say, this game is so survivor based, this game is so survivor based. But in reality, a lot of the data actually suggests that hunters win significantly more than survivors in every single tier. Well, there's a few problems with the data that got released. Well, that's only the first week. Does that carry over beyond the first week? Furthermore, does that carry over with other servers? Every server is different, right? So what sort of data trends can we rely on? All right. And that is where I wanted to explore a little bit more and ask myself, well, what about now? Because we know that from season 11 to season 12, all right, the hunters win rate, okay, has pretty much stayed the same. It's actually dropped off a little tiny bit, okay? But what we do know in regards to the survivor win rate is that they're relatively around the same. All right, so that well, actually, if anything, that's not necessarily true. It's dropped a little bit for win rate plus draw, but for the most part, we've seen that for two seasons now. Hunters are pretty much the ones that are dominating. So what I decided to do is I decided, okay, there's such limited data in this game. There's not much that I can work with. The one thing that I can work with is high tiers. So I have to rely on the devs to tell me about tier 1, 2, 3, 4. You're going to see in the data, it only says tier 5. Remember, the first week after an update, that's what you're looking at in terms of tiers, right? People aren't tier 6 then. And I was like, all right, well, how about I take the top 100 hunters, the top 100 survivors on 3 separate servers, which would mean 600 players' data, and see how they're doing now. All right, about a month in or a couple of weeks into the season to see what the sort of difference is in between those win rates. Now, something that you may not realize is that I've also calculated the data from season 7 and a little bit of data from season 8, right before Blood Queen's real, significant launch. Okay, and what I found surprisingly is not only is this game significantly hunter-sided for high tiers, but what I found is that the data trends for the top 100 are relatively exactly the same for China, Southeast Asia, and Northern America and Europe. Pretty fascinating. I wasn't expecting the data to look so close to one another. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that when we calculate the top 100, we see that China's survivors have about a 45% win rate. We also see that for China's hunters, top 100, they have about a 66% win rate. Southeast Asia, the survivors are 48%, about 2% higher, 3%. But their hunters' win rates are 68%. And then NAEU, you have 47.6%, which is still a little bit higher than China's. That doesn't mean our survivors are better, by the way. That's not what the data represents. I wanna make that very clear. All right, you guys got to be very careful with how we interpret data. All right, so these are just the numbers. What we are looking for is just generally speaking, is there going to be a pattern? And I just talk like that because I forgot to calculate. And the average win rate for the top 100 for NAEU is 66% for hunters. What's interesting is that, again, we saw that when we compared mechanic to prisoner ratios a few videos back, we saw that China and NAEU usually closely resemble each other, and Southeast Asia typically have their own sort of unique style, their unique trends. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for this data, right? You got to be very careful when you compare top 10s. It's not fair. Some people just play more. Some people prefer different characters. Some people play the meta. Other people don't, all right? Then you also have PC players that you have to factor in, right? So you cannot look at this data and say, okay, well, the top 10 in Southeast Asia is better than China because their win rate is a little bit. You got to be careful with doing that. You can't do that. The point of this data is that it suggests things. It doesn't convince you that one server is better than the other because, you know, they're 4% higher. It doesn't work like that. It's not statistically significant in order to make that comparison. But what we can see is that when you compare top 10s, all right, which is technically 20 players per server, right? We're looking at survivors and hunters. It's not a big enough sample size to really tell you a lot. So that's why we look at the top 100. And we see that from a top 100 standpoint, from 3 different servers, hunters are significantly outclassing survivors. And I believe that the development team knows that. That's why the development team are making adjustments in terms of the persona web. They're making it easier for you to throw pallets down. That's why they're making some adjustments in terms of where things are located on the persona web. They're also including different communication strategies so you know which ciphers are being worked on. And they're really trying to address this. All right. Now, the problem with my methodology, all right? The problem with this methodology, and remember too, for NAEU, you got to remember that we're a week behind, is that the top 100 doesn't tell us about tier 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's going to be an argument. And that's a very true point. What I would say is that the NAEU server is the least reliable for data. Our server is a little bit smaller, harder to really gauge that. Southeast Asia is much bigger. China is much bigger. But for the most part, we can reasonably say that at least in high tiers, hunters have a significant advantage. They have a significant advantage. This is not a survivor-based game. Now, it may be different when you compare tier 4s. I don't have data on that. Now, somebody can say, well, it's hunter-sided in high tiers and survivor-sided in low tiers. But there's really no data to support that other than anecdotal. What I can tell you again is also when we look at, now remember, within any methodology, there's always flaws. Okay, there's always going to be flaws with any methodology. And I'm telling you, well, mine are. But what I can tell you is that in season 7, at the end of season 7, I did calculate the data. And it was about the same, 63 to 45% in terms of win rate for China. When we compared it in Asia, the top 100 was 58 to 47%. So in Southeast Asia, it was closer in season 7 than what it is now. Since season 7 to now, it's only increased the gap. Because now we're talking about 48 to 68. So since season 7, it's only benefited hunters even more than what it is now. In NAEU season 7, I didn't bother calculating that. Don't get mad at me. It's just the data on NAEU is very, it's not as reliable. It's a smaller sample size, and I didn't have enough time. So I did take a look at that. All right. Now, what I will tell you from my own anecdotal evidence in regards to the data that I've been able to calculate, it almost seems like season 8, right before Blood Queen was launched, it seemed like the top 10 were getting closer together. When we compare the top 10s in season 8, the numbers were significantly closer, at least for China and Southeast Asia. All right, I have a lot of spreadsheets here. I didn't calculate top 100 in season 8, but I did calculate the win rate for the top 10. And in China, it was 58 to 56%. That's the closest I've ever seen it. That was the end of season 8. I believe on Southeast Asia it was 65 to 50, which is still closer. And then I think on Northern America and Europe, it was 58 to 56%. Unfortunately, that data is not as reliable because it was only the top 10. But what I can tell you is that when we compare top 10, season 8 was right before Blood Queen's launch, was when the game was probably the most balanced. And that, I mean, you know, they're making a lot of adjustments, right? One of the things that we can't do is say the dev team's doing nothing. That's not true. It's a lot easier to bitch. It really is. It's just a lot easier to complain and complain, right? It's one thing to talk about ping. That's a different story. But with balance, it's very... Balance and ping are different things. Ping, you got your argument. Balance is very difficult because people will always complain no matter what you do. That is just the reality of it. The devs are not allowed to say that, but I am. But I look at all the changes that the devs are trying to do. But what I see ultimately is that from season 7 to now, there hasn't, maybe they have different data, but only comparing top 100, we're seeing that it's relatively the same. But if you compare it to season 8 to now, you would say that it's probably gotten worse. Right around that Blood Queen launch, give or take. This game for high tiers is absolutely hunter-sided. The data suggests it. The data backs it up. The data that the development team gave backs it up. It is significantly harder to win right now as a survivor in legendary mode than what it is for a hunter. That's just the truth. And the devs know that, and that's why they have the message system. They're changing the persona webs. There's different characters. They're being adjusted. But I did want to take a crack at this using the most data available that we have to really answer that question. The real question is, what is the data for the lower tiers? And again, you can say that in the lower tiers, it's more survivor based because you can have comms, you can have multiple characters, all right? But the problem is that there's actually no data that suggests it. And what we do know is that really good hunters still dominate down there. In fact, their win rates are more likely to decrease getting to tier 5 than what they are to stay in tier 4. However, that is a hypothesis as well. I'd like to hear your input as well. Remember that in all 3 servers, the data trends are the same for high tiers. I do expect the data to be very different among lower tiers among the 3 servers. I can tell you that as somebody who plays in Southeast Asia, their hunters in lower tiers are significantly better than NAEU, at least from an anecdotal perspective. It's night and day. I've had multiple top tier competitors come over to Southeast Asia. They'll tell you the same thing. There hasn't been one person that disagrees with that. But then again, I don't know how to compare that to China. For NAEU, it's always going to be the smallest sample size, which means it allows for the most bias. A bigger sample size, more people to analyze means better data, more reliable, and the way you measure it is also an important factor. You have validity and reliability. So that is what the data suggests, that this is a very hunter-sided server. It has been for a long time. However, somewhere around season 7 and season 8, something happened, and it just coincidentally happens to be that Blood Queen, I believe, was around that time, but I could be wrong. I can't remember on the top of my head. I would like to hear from you guys. Give me your feedback, but seriously, numbers suggest very hunter-sided in the top tiers, in the most competitive scenes. And yeah, I'd like to hear your input. Don't have any data on 5v5. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. You guys have a good day. Bye now.